The War of Northern Aggression, or the American Civil War, was a complete tragedy from the racialist viewpoint. To start off this video, I want to read you an excerpt from Madison Grant's The Conquest of a Continent. In 1860, the religious unity of the United States had been somewhat impaired. The unity of language was as yet scarcely menaced. The unity of institutions, traditions, and culture was breached only temporarily. The racial unity of the country was little changed from 1790. The United States was still 9/10 Nordic. Earlier in these pages, a description is given of the empty continent, which lay open to settlement by the British stock on both sides of the Canadian border. Let us see what use was made of this opportunity in the period from the end of colonial times to the Civil War. A continent was occupied and the territory of the Union was swept westward to the Pacific. The forests were cut down and the wildlife destroyed. The Indians were evicted. The mineral wealth of the western mountains was ransacked, the coal was exploited, and the once fertile soil of the southern states greatly depleted through the reckless growing of tobacco and cotton. Waste was the order of the day in America. All this was perhaps inevitable, but never since Caesar plundered Gaul has such a large territory been sacked in so short a time. Probably no more destructive human being has ever appeared on the world stage than the American pioneer with his axe and his rifle. In 1860, at the end of this period, we find the essential elements of national unity still unchanged, but we were about to engage in a fratricidal war, which was to destroy the best blood of the nation. We had admitted large numbers of Irish and German immigrants who impaired, in the case of the Irish, our religious system and introduced certain undesirable racial elements. The Germans who came were largely Protestants and only temporarily disturbed our unity by clinging to their foreign language. Both of these elements, however, were predominantly Nordic, and it was not until the next and final period that the unassimilable Alpines and Mediterraneans came here from southern and eastern Europe. The tragedy of the Civil War and the introduction of cheap labor were still to come, so that in 1860 the United States was at its high watermark of national unity. The Indians had been ruthlessly swept aside, as was unavoidable because a few hunting tribes could not be allowed to possess an entire continent, but the Negro question could have been postponed, and the men who died needlessly on southern battlefields could have been used to populate the states of the far west. Now allow me to jump forward in history. This is an excerpt from the book Bruder Schweigen, written by Frank DeSilva. In this book, he describes a conversation that him and Robert Miles had at the 1983 Aryan Nations Church of Jesus Christ Christian National Congress. Bob was a leader of the Mountain Kirk clan and a man of great knowledge. So let me read you this excerpt here. Bob, or Robert Miles, motioned for me to sit down on an outcropping of small boulders clustered together, and Bob managed to find a spot large enough for him to rest comfortably. And now we were about the same height, and he seemed to relax a bit, and I realized that the silvery hair that he sported was not simply a touch of elegance, but that age was creeping up on him. And I felt the present change from one man of talk to one of generations. And this imbued the moment with a certain nostalgia. Then as now, and the feeling of mentor and pupil was strong. He was quiet for a second, and then he began to basically paraphrase the latest work he had delivered. He talked to me about the order in which he saw the development of a young, strong cadre of men who could then lead others into the coming battle against those who had secured, for a time, the direction and spirit of the folk, and then dashed the organic impulse of nation and blood, and because of this theft, should then be made to pay for this immoral and dishonest suspension of natural law. On this night was the first time the visualization of ethnic genocide was presented to me. Genocide has been practiced by peoples since time immemorial, and the Jewish people cannot lay this claim as only happening to their own, disregarding their numerous tribal genocides against their enemies invoked and commanded by their tribal god, on those with whom they were to come into contact with. What we were talking about, in essence, was the planned and ruthless reorganization of a Western American society, just like had taken place in so many instances of our European antiquity, Germany being only one instance, as one should also include the Russian and Spanish histories, replete with secret societies, Marrano Jews, anti-religionists, and a host of other natural and unnatural evolutions within a society, yet seem to always benefit a small but powerful minority of ideas and individuals. Not always members of the Jewish race, but always a highly significant number. After the smoke had cleared from the fusillades of revolution and chaos, but in our case in America, this had transpired without a shot being fired in public view. Bob was clear. He had seen this in the Hungarian Revolution, as well as in the historical Russian history. He had fought this red menace all of his adult life, had spent time in prison, and had paid his dues. I remarked that after all this effort, very little, if anything, seemed to have changed. He eyed me levelly and nodded his assent. It was hard for him, I realized, and tried to make up for it, for I did not want to lessen his obvious self-sacrifice and dedication. I did not mean to infer that you are to blame or that your efforts have counted for nothing. What I mean to say is, what can we do? Bob replied, the movement is fragmented. Individuals and groups are fighting for the scraps left to them in the regional histories in which they grew up. This is natural, but at some point in the real world, a declaration must be made to everyone that a focused and rational plan must be put forth and accepted, which will bring us all under one banner. The South, for one, of which I have fought side by side with very many good men for some 40 years, are close-minded, very Celtic in disposition, and only worry about their own world, the one in which they live in now, just like when they was faced by the Roman armies of Julius Caesar. A leader was raised, Vercingetorix, but who spent more time fighting his peers than he did Julius until the end was near. The tendency of the Celts to jealousy, brought into relief by the modern French, is what I see in the South. In the North, you have the Germanic elements, industrious but loyal to government, to a fault, and is harder for them to break away from the stoic realities of ritual and discipline. Even today, this is a strong element in Michigan and the surrounding states, heavily Germanic. The Midwest, a combination of the two, has more flexibility than either the North or the South, but many are of the farmer class, and unless you force their hand, take away their livelihoods, and threaten the future of their children in a real and immediate fashion, is difficult to mobilize as well. What will push them over the edge remains to be seen, but once started, as the Germanic element is wired this way, It will slowly build until it cannot be stopped. The military question as relates to the Germanic element remains, as always, problematic, as many of the American military field grade commanders are Germans by blood and inclination, and will solidly support the existing system, as they only see tradition, and the military is based on tradition, regardless of who has brought change to this environment. In the West, you have a unique and open splendor of both space and ideology, coupled with the fact that, in large part, those who inhabit the western half are the sons and daughters of the last generation of pioneers, of sturdy and deliberate folk pressed, if you will, to find a place to settle, always looking for that special something just over the horizon. And these individuals are both the strongest and weakest links in our racial human chain. The West and the Northwest are the most individualistic, but in a different way from those hardy folk of Virginia and Tennessee, fixed to a landscape and inured of their traditions, not really looking for anything different, and seems, by all accounts, to be prime for the concept of a territorial imperative. The government forces know this, have always known this, but until recently have not given them cause or have proven to be anything to worry about. Now, with farms being foreclosed, men like Singer and Call paying with their lives, the public attention has finally been pointed in our direction. Can we capitalize on this? That is the question. In there he's talking about Gordon Call. Back during the 1980s, of course, there was lots of farmer foreclosures. This was a phenomena that occurred heavily in the Midwest of the United States. But as far as this video goes, it's going to be broken into several segments. We're going to look a little bit at the Civil War and its effects in southern Appalachia. We're going to also discuss something very interesting that I have found only recently, several months ago. It is the belief that in the Confederacy, the Southern planter class, the aristocratic cotton farmers, they developed this unique racial mythos in which that they claimed that they were the descendants of Norman nobility compared to the Yankees, who were the descendants of the common Englishman. We're also going to look at the Celtic influence as well, and what I have came to see the War of Northern Aggression as. It was truly a continuation of old world blood feuds that erupted into new world violence. But before I continue, let's take a trip to nearby Chickamauga Battlefield. Today, we are at the Chickamauga Battlefield, which is in Catoosa and Walker County, Georgia. We're going to take a tour here. I'm going to show you some of the sights, some of the artifacts. I'm probably going to narrate, give y'all some background information about the battle itself. But first, let's look at these cannons they have on display. This is a 12-pounder mountain howitzer. It says here it was a mobile and lightweight piece designed for rough terrain, used primarily in the Western Theater during the Civil War. Some models featured a breakdown carriage that allowed the gun to be packed on mules. Batteries of mountain howitzers were popularly known to the troops as jackass batteries. It's got a range of about 900 yards at a 5-degree elevation. It's made of bronze. You can see that a little bit of a patina is starting to form. Some of the other cannons we'll show you, you'll also see that the patina is on. The tube itself, I believe, weighs 220 pounds, and it used solid shot, round shell, canister, or case. So let's walk over here. It's a hot day down here in Georgia. You can see the beautiful split rail fence they got there. Variety of oak trees, different hardwoods. Over here, they have another cannon display. Here shortly we'll go inside and check out some of the artifacts. They got these battlefield monuments across the country. This is one in Lookout Mountain over in Chattanooga. It's the New York Peace Monument, dedicated in 1910. We also have, this must be a Union one here, the Pennsylvania 77th Regiment. And this is just a plaque showing all the different sort of exhibits and displays. Let's go up here and look at the cannons. Looks like they may be having a program of some sort today. We'll look at these cannons first. This is a 6-pounder smoothbore gun. As you can see, the patina. It was manufactured in 1841, 20 years before the war, by N.P. Ames of Springfield, Massachusetts. Note the multiple vent holes along the barrel.
We'll see if it's as good today as it was yesterday.
At the breech, I should say.
Parked right here?
And the battered condition of the barrel.
Right.
Look closer, you can see that there's a lot of dents in it.
No.
It had a range of 1,520 yards at 5 degrees elevation. It's made of bronze. Weighed about 881 pounds, the tube does, it says. Used solid shot, round shell, canister, and case as projectiles. Over here, we have a 12-pound howitzer. This gun tube was manufactured for the Confederacy in 1862 by the Tredegar Iron Works out of Richmond, Virginia. After the Napoleon, the 12-pounder howitzer was the most widely used artillery piece here at this battle. It had a range of 1,070 yards at 5 degrees elevation, made of bronze. The tube weighed 785 pounds, and it also used solid shot, round shell, canister, and case as projectiles. Here we have a 3-inch ordnance rifle. It could fire projectiles long distances, but its effectiveness was limited on Chickamauga's thick woods. As you can see around here, we're basically in, temperate southern forest here. It was limited in Chickamauga's thick woods. Its manufacturing process was perfected by a guy named John Griffin. It had a range of 1,830 yards at 5 degrees elevation. The metal, the tube is made of wrought iron. The tube weighs, I believe, 817 pounds, it says here. It used solid shot and shell. Now we'll go over here and take a look at these weapons. This artillery. Look at the rifling on the tube here, this particular cannon. This is a 12-pounder rifled James, it's called. Converted from 6-pounder smoothbore gun to a 12-pounder rifled gun near the beginning of the Civil War. The term pounder refers to the weight of the projectile shot. So it was a 12-pound projectile. A rifled gun is identified by the spiraling grooves in its bore. And Wes just showed you that a second ago. It had a range of 1,700 yards at 5 degrees elevation. Gunmetal bronze, of course. Tube weight, 886 pounds. It shot solid shot, shell, and canister. Now, this, I think, was the most popular weapon, piece of artillery. This is a 12-pounder Napoleon. The first weapon of this type was designed for Emperor Napoleon III of France and adapted for use in the United States in 1857, a few years before the war broke out. These mobile guns became popular workhorses of the artillery, especially deadly in stopping infantry assaults. It has a range of 1,620 yards at 5 degrees elevation, bronze. The tube weighs 1,225 pounds. The projectiles used were solid shot, round shell, canister, and case. Now, we have a 10-pounder Parrott. A new rifled gun invented just before the Civil War by Robert P. Parrott and manufactured at the West Point Foundry in New York. Larger guns of this type could fire an explosive shell up to 4.5 miles away. It's got a range of 1,850 yards at 5 degrees elevation. It can shoot up to 3 miles at a 20-degree elevation. Did I say 3 miles? I didn't mean to say, I thought I said 20 miles. 3 miles at 20-degree elevation. It's made of cast iron. The tube weighs about 890 pounds, and it used solid shot and shell.
Okay.
A lot of interesting history here. Captain Samuel Jackson. That was Andrew Jackson's grandson right there. He was born at the Hermitage on June the 9th, 1837, to Andrew Jackson Jr. and his wife Sarah York.
Yeah. I mean, I'm part of I've got an old suit that was, it's that type of weather. So. Yeah.
And so I had some pasta salad, got this made, and I guzzled down like a 10 ounce. I don't know how big that's right. What's it, 20 ounce? What is 16?
This lady was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. Relocated her family to Mobile, Alabama when she was a young child. She was an ardent Confederate supporter. She was a nurse at Shiloh in 1862. She then worked with the Army of Tennessee, which was the Confederate army that was here. It's interesting. Black soldier that fought for the 44th Mississippi Infantry Regiment. Yeah. And here's some of the lives that was lost at the Battle of Chickamauga. There's Sergeant Richard R. Kirkland. He was from Upper Kershaw County, South Carolina. Enlisted as a private. Ended up becoming a sergeant. He was most well known for his heroic actions at Fredericksburg, where he carried water to Union soldiers lying on the field, wounded. For this act, he became known as the Angel of Mary's Heights. He continued to fight for the Confederacy and died charging Snodgrass Hill at Chickamauga on September the 20th, 1863. A lot of lives lost. Here's a picture of Braxton Bragg. He was a general of the Confederate States of America. There's a picture of him. One of the leaders of the Confederacy. Leonidas Polk, Lieutenant General. There's a picture of him. James Longstreet, Lieutenant General, picture of him. He was here as well. Then William Joseph Hardy, Lieutenant General, also present. Signed. Here we have the hated, to a degree, William Tecumseh Sherman, Major General. Ulysses S. Grant. This was actually the first national military park in the United States. George Henry Thomas, Major General for the Union. And William Stark Rosecrans, who was present here at the Battle of Chickamauga. There's a note. Libby prison escape. Some of the tools that were used. This is just a wall showing some of the history. Here's a battery wagon.
Yes, can you take it off for me?
It's believed to be the only surviving battery wagon from the Civil War period. It was restored in 1978. more artifacts here. This is a arrowhead from possibly around 8,000 years ago. Pocket watch component, part of a soldier's pocket watch.
No, except you. Why don't we get it in the car?
Mini ball, 58 caliber, right there. Fork and a knife. Round ball, 69 caliber. Round lead shot was the oldest projectile used by both Union and Confederate forces. There's a USMC coat button. Damaged Frankfurt Arsenal National Match Rifle cartridge case right there. Infield rifle bullet.
This cover's right. Get it on. It's red first.
Cannonball fragment right there. Spencer rifle cartridges right there. 52 caliber. Another 58 caliber bullet.
Did you get it?
36 caliber.
Don't.
And this is a grommet right here. Had a variety of utilitarian uses. Here's an old saber. Cannonball there. Fowler's Alabama battery. 4 Napoleons. Warren's Mississippi Light Artillery. He had 2 Napoleons, 2 James. This area is much, this battlefield park is very large. There's honestly more than I can cover here today. Might show you a couple of more things and then we'll get back to it. That looks like you on film. Large map of things. These various displays here. The battering wagon that we just seen in the other room. Case and limbering team. Here's a cannon limbering team. Interesting. Just the logistics of conducting such a war is impressive. There's a traveling forge. On the blacksmiths, this was a Union traveling forge. Had a lot of breakdowns traveling over, the Union had a lot of breakdowns traveling over the mountainous terrain on their way here, so they had to have that to make repairs. Spencer rifle. Spencer cartridges. like his hat. I want me a hat like that. Here's a warlog. This is a tree trunk that was taken from the battlefield. You can see it has cannon in it. Riddled with bullets, shells, canister. Look at that. It's interesting. They preserved them in this case. Over here, we have a variety of different artifacts, trinkets, things of that nature. Just like canteens up there. Rifle barrel was found. Old saber. Cannonballs, cartridges, bullets. Fragments of cannonballs. This is Ambrose Ringley. This was his, must have been his personal canteen. He's in the 72nd Indiana Infantry. Photo right there was taken of him in 1910. Specifics of the battle. There's James Longstreet. Longstreet was very successful at Chickamauga. He exploits the gap that was formed in the Union lines. Let's go in here and look at the weapons. In here, they have a really nice display of the various muskets, rifles that was used. As you can see, this military park is very, very vast. And what I'm showing you right now is the collection of hundreds of rifles, shotguns, and other weapons. Some are replicas, some are authentic. But as I show you this, I'm going to give you a little bit of background information about the Battle of Chickamauga. The Battle of Chickamauga took place between September the 18th through September the 20th, 1863, near the Chickamauga Creek, just outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. This battle occurred largely in what is now Walker and Catoosa counties in northwest Georgia. Confederate General Braxton Bragg had been driven from the city of Chattanooga by Union forces earlier in the month by the Union's Major General William Rosecrans, and Bragg then became determined to retake the city. After Gettysburg, the Battle of Chickamauga was the deadliest battle of the American Civil War. As far as lives lost, wounded, and casualties, there were a total of over 34,000 casualties. The Union forces numbered about 60,000, Confederate forces around 65,000. The Battle of Chickamauga. Following a few light skirmishes on September the 17th, the battle began taking form the following day, with many more skirmishes, most notably between mounted regiments, before the battle intensified on the morning of the 19th. This day, the Confederate forces repeatedly assaulted Union lines but could not break through. The fighting resumed in similar fashion the following day. However, some misinformation in the Union camp caused a gap to open for the Confederate troops to push through, dispersing as much of 1/3 of the Union army. The Confederates continued the attack, the remaining Union forces at a high cost. However, the Union forces, now commanded by Major General George H. Thomas, held out until nightfall when they retreated back to Chattanooga. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Bragg's forces then proceeded to besiege the city of Chattanooga for over 1 month until relief forces commanded by Ulysses S. Grant dispersed the Confederate forces and sent them into retreat. After the 3 days of battle, just under 4,000 men fell and a further 25,000 were wounded, with the Confederacy sustaining a larger share of the casualties than the Union. The battle, of course, included the Army of the Cumberland, the Union division, and the Army of Tennessee. The leaders of the Army of Tennessee for the Confederacy were, of course, Braxton Bragg, who I just mentioned, James Longstreet, John Bell Hood, and John C. Breckinridge. The commanders and leaders of the Union Army of the Cumberland was, of course, William Rosecrans, who I mentioned, George H. Thomas, Thomas L. Crittenden, and Alexander McCook. But now, I want to give you a little bit of information as a side note. We're going to talk about a guy whose name was Hans Christian Heg. Hans Christian Heg was a Norwegian man who had came over to Wisconsin with his family as a child. He was a Norwegian-American abolitionist, journalist, anti-slavery activist, politician, and soldier. And he was best known for leading the Scandinavian 15th Wisconsin Infantry Regiment on the Union side. He was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga. He was born on December the 21st, 1829 in Leer, Norway, and he died September the 20th, the final day of fighting in 1863. He was 33 years old. But what caught my attention about this man was the vandalism of his statue in Madison, Wisconsin during the Summer of Love back in 2020. A statue of Hans Christian Heg, which was built by sculptor Paul Fjeld. It was installed at King Street approach to the state capitol in Madison, Wisconsin in 1925. On June the 23rd, 2020, rioters, incensed by the arrest of a member of Black Lives Matter, used a towing vehicle to pull the statue down. It was then vandalized, decapitated, and thrown into Lake Monona. The words "Black is beautiful" were spray painted on the plinth just above Heg's name. So see, on July the 20th, 2020, the Wisconsin Capitol and Exclusive Residence Board voted unanimously to restore both Heg's statue to their original condition and placement atop the pedestals. I just thought this was interesting, and it really shows the current predicament that the Native European here in America is currently in. It does not matter. It does not matter in the least if you are an advocate for black rights. I mean, Hans Christian Heg here, he was an abolitionist. And look what these people did to his statue. If this does not illustrate, and I know everyone watching this, you I'm very certain that you see the same things that I do. You're aware of all of these things. But to the uninitiated, to the naive white man and woman in this country, do you not see how these people behave? Do you not understand that if things were ever to get helter-skelter, if chaos was to ensue, it does not matter in the least if you are a liberal, an egalitarian, and an advocate for black rights. When the time comes, you will be on the chopping block as well. No amount of pleading will save you. I just thought the vandalism of this Hans Christian Heg statue is a sort of lesson that could be learned. It's just a matter of whether or not the white people are willing to pay attention. Now it's time to talk about Appalachia. You see, Appalachia, southern and central Appalachia, during the settlement of this country, Appalachia was the borderlands. And it's kind of fitting, you could say, that the Ulster Scots, the Lowland Scots, and the Northern English were the vast number of settlers who first settled this area. Appalachia back then was a borderland. And if you know anything about the history of England and Scotland, you know about the violent history between both of these nations. And you also know that the Ulster Scots, the Lowland Scots, and the Northern English fought often. So it's very fitting, you could say, that this was also the borderland. Now, while Appalachia and southern Appalachia did not have the large-scale battles such as what we've seen with Gettysburg and Chickamauga, certainly not in scale, there was, however, a ton of guerrilla activity. And honestly, I find some of this guerrilla activity to be even more fascinating than some of the large, massive, pitched battles. Of course, those are interesting as well, but some of the stories that came out of Appalachia are quite terrible. Guerrilla conflict. You see, it was extremely contentious. My neck of the woods in northeast Tennessee, we didn't see any large-scale battles, but there was a lot of guerrilla activity. It was the same in western North Carolina, southwest Virginia, eastern Kentucky. And it's amazing to me, but you see, East Tennessee almost became like West Virginia. East Tennessee was largely pro-Union. And it's, like I said, it was extremely contentious. There was a lot of railroads in East Tennessee, western North Carolina, southwest Virginia, eastern Kentucky, on up into what is now West Virginia. My friend Billy Bob, for instance, up in West Virginia, his ancestors were Confederate guerrillas. You see, West Virginia broke off from the rest of the state of Virginia because of the mountainous terrain, you could say, for economic reasons. Not a whole lot of slaves in West Virginia. And it was the same here in East Tennessee, parts of western North Carolina. You see, it's an extremely complicated, complex subject with nuance. Now, as too far as my knowledge goes, the one family member that I can confirm that was in the Civil War, that fought in the Civil War, I would show you a picture right now of his tombstone, because he's buried just probably about 3/4 of a mile up the holler from where I was raised. My father's side of the family, there is so many of my ancestors buried just in this one cemetery. Paternal grandparents, great-grandparents on both sides. I mean, it goes back for generations. My great-grandfather's uncle, he fought in the 13th Cavalry Regiment of Tennessee. Now, I would show you a picture of his tombstone, but me and him, we have the same name. We have different middle names. My great-grandfather was named after him. I was named after my great-grandfather. Now, he was born in 1820, and he died in 1918. That is by far the longest-lived family member that I know of. You know, it's kind of amazing to me to fathom what all he's seen during his life. He was born on down in North Carolina. I'm not sure exactly where, but I do know that his family, my ancestors, he was the oldest. He was my great-great-grandfather's oldest brother, and he would have been 42, maybe 43 when he enlisted for the 13th Cavalry Regiment of Tennessee. Now here's the kicker. The 13th Cavalry Regiment of Tennessee, they mustered down in Knoxville, but they were a Union cavalry regiment. And he fought in the Second Battle of Saltville and the Battle of Marion. These battles occurred up in southwestern Virginia. Not West Virginia, but southwestern Virginia. So he had to travel all the way down there. I mean, he would have been 42, maybe 43. And I mean, he lived up until 1918. You know, it's kind of mind-blowing to me that what all he's seen during his lifetime, 98 years. You know, a lot of the men on my father's side of the family, we don't really live that long. I mean, my paternal grandfather, he didn't even live to be 60. He was 59 when he passed away back in 1985. So, it's extremely complex. You know, I am an Appalachian. Could call me an Appalachianist. I adhere to Appalachianism. And in this video, Front Porch Esotericism, I talked about formulating some sort of philosophy called Appalachianism. I don't know entirely what that is yet, but I'm working on it. But anyways, one of the things that I admire the most about Appalachians is their militancy and their utter contempt for authority. Now, even though my great-grandfather's uncle fought for the Union, we certainly weren't Yankees by any means. You see, Appalachia, it was like I said, I've said it 100 times, but it was extremely contentious. And what I admire perhaps the most is the Appalachian contempt for authority. And I would say that I consider Appalachia to be a distinct area. We're not part of Dixie. You could say we are the Upper South. And we do share similarities, commonalities with other Southerners, but we would call them Flatlanders. It's amazing to me that East Tennessee did not break off and form its own principality. There are 33 counties today in East Tennessee. Back in the 1860s, I'm not sure, but there were at least 32. At the most, there were 32. There may be in a few less, because some counties were not formed up until like the 1870s or so. I know one of the neighboring counties to my home county was not formed until 1875. That's where I get the number 32 from. But in all of East Tennessee, during the referendum regarding secession, all but 2 counties, only 2, in the entirety of East Tennessee, voted in favor of secession. The other, let's see, 30, 29, I'm not sure of the number of counties back then, they all voted to remain in the Union. And I'm sorry about the background noise here. This is just something I have to deal with. This is my new office, you could say. My daughter's nursery, we're working on it upstairs. So I apologize for that. But just to give you an idea, it was overwhelmingly Unionist. And the natives here, my ancestors, and the people that lived here, by and large, detested being told by their own state government what to do. They did not care in the least for what Nashville had to say. And they went against it. And this produced this extremely treacherous and contentious guerrilla warfare that we see. Lots of brutality, tons of atrocity. Like I said, not the same large-scale pitched battles, but there was brutality and violence that was perhaps unrivaled with what you would have seen perhaps in Bleeding, Kansas, and other areas. So I consider Appalachia to be its own sort of unique area. It is the hinterland. It is a land that is caught between the north and the south. It has traits of both. On up into central Appalachia, you could say that it has perhaps a little bit of more of a sort of Yankee flair. Southern Appalachia, more of a southern flair. But I do consider it distinct. Slavery, by and large, was not a thing here in southern Appalachia. Let me read you an article right quick. Let me pull up my laptop here. This is an article from the local news station back home in northeast Tennessee. This is to give you an idea of the number of slaves that was in the northeast corner of Tennessee. Going back to those 2 counties that voted in favor of secession, one of them was a border county to my home county, Sullivan County, which I find extremely interesting. Sullivan County is where Kingsport and Bristol is today. They voted in favor of secession, and also Meigs County, Tennessee, voted in favor of secession. Meigs County is to the immediate north of where I live currently, and but you know, all these other large counties voted to remain in the Union. So let me read this article here for you. On June 8, 1861, Tennessee leaders voted to secede from the United States. Following the suit of 10 other states, Tennessee was the last state to join the Confederacy, and a civil war would bloody American history for the next 4 years. This was the state's second consideration of the matter. Tennessee voters rejected a proposal for a state convention that would consider the secession of Tennessee from the Union on February the 9th, only a few months beforehand. Most local historians say that most East Tennessee counties voted to stay in the Union, just what I mentioned. Angie Fellers Mason, executive director at the Washington County Heritage Alliance, said that it was the votes in Middle and West Tennessee that pushed the state to join the Confederacy. You see, Middle and West Tennessee, what we would consider the flatlands from my neck of the woods, they are much wealthier. There were many more slaves there, plantations. Let's see, Northeast Tennessee votes to stay in the Union. In the June 8th vote that solidified the state's secession, East Tennessee's votes showed that voters opposed the secession. East Tennessean voters remained against separation by a margin of 32,923, or 68%, to 14,780, 32%. So roughly 2 out of 3 citizens that voted wanted to stay in the Union. Steve Nash, an associate professor of history at East Tennessee State University, notes that Northeast Tennessee is the outlier of the region. While he says it's common for people to think of southern Appalachia as pro-Union, places like western North Carolina and southwestern Virginia tended to lean toward the Confederacy, which this is fascinating in itself. Citing Mountain Rebels by W. Todd Gross, Nash said that East Tennesseans represented the largest population of people arrested for dissent to the Confederacy during the war. According to the American Civil War Museum, leaders from the South feared that the election of President Abraham Lincoln spelled the end for enslavement in the South. Documents from Virginia Secession Convention in March 1861 demanded that the United States government that involuntary servitude as it now exists shall remain and shall not be changed south of Virginia's northern border at the time. Nash said the region's relationship to the institution of slavery complicates the picture of the region even up to the eve of the war. He said enslaved people made up anywhere from 10 to 12% of the population in Appalachia. That might be a little high in my opinion. According to historians with Black in Appalachia, oh yes, Black in Appalachia, that's another one of these non-governmental organizations here in Appalachia that is trying to, subvert and take things from the heritage Appalachian. But according to these historians, there were 1,084 people in Sullivan County that were enslaved, which translates to 8% of the population, and 2,584 in Washington County, Virginia in 1860, which was 15% of the population. Washington County, Virginia is, you see, Bristol, Tennessee is split in half roughly. There's Bristol, Tennessee, there's State Street in downtown Bristol, and on the other side of State Street, that's Virginia, Washington County, Virginia. There's also a Washington County, Tennessee nearby, which is where Johnson City is. The same year, Washington County recorded 104 free black people, and Sullivan County recorded 247 free individuals. That doesn't mean Appalachians were disconnected from slavery. It doesn't mean slavery wasn't very important within the region. I beg to differ. East Tennessee is much poorer on average than Middle Tennessee and West Tennessee. But Nash said it's important to draw the line between a Unionist and an abolitionist, and stressed that just because someone such as Andrew Johnson, who was from Greenville, Tennessee, was pro-Union, but he believed the Constitution protected enslavement. These Unionists were very much supportive of the institution of slavery. They argued that secession would actually be detrimental to the protection of the institution, so many of them argued against secession because they saw that as the best way of protecting slavery. Tracks to the war. Although no major battles broke out in the region, Nash and Mason said that the railroads drew the eyes of both armies to the area. Nash said that in the 1850s and 60s, the railroad connected southwest Virginia to the rest of the state. As a result, the enslaved population began to increase as the entire state's economy reaped the benefits of stable crop production that could have pushed that region more into the Confederacy. Mason details several accounts of regiments marching through Jonesboro, which is also in Washington County, Tennessee. It is the oldest township in the state of Tennessee, and noted that the line was vital to the Confederacy early in the war. The railroad also brought out bridge-burning Unionists, she added, bent on cutting the Confederacy's supply line. Nash said the Union did have plans to send troops to East Tennessee, but the movement never went forward, and Union control didn't reach the region until Knoxville fell in 1863. So this is when I assumed that the 13th Cavalry Regiment would have been formed. Abraham Lincoln was very interested in East Tennessee, both from what we would kind of call public relations element, which is he wanted to bring these Southern Unionists back into the Union. On a larger part, it's strategic. It's those railroads, it's the supply lines, it's the connections between Virginia to the Tennessee border that then goes down to Knoxville, and then there's a railroad connection that then heads into Georgia. I think part of that is because Jonesboro has a fair amount of money in it, and that tends to be who supports the Confederacy, especially early on. So see, this is one of the large reasons why East Tennessee was pro-Union. They did not have the wealth, nor the slaves, nor the rocky soil. You know, it's not, the soil in Appalachia is fertile, but it's rocky, and these hollers are not conducive to large-scale plantation farming that you see on down in the flatlands on throughout Dixie. She notes one of the more prominent Jonesboro citizens, an industrialist and merchant named Alfred Eugene Jackson, rose through the ranks of the Confederacy to become a brigadier general. Loyalties shifted, though, and the town reflected more Union sympathy by the war's end in 1865, complete with a pro-Union sheriff. Mason said some merchants scrambled to show Union support as the war came to a close, but not every Confederate supporter gained sympathy from the sheriff. There are some people who are not welcome back in town, she says. The Jackson family is not welcome back in town, of course, being a brigadier general. His property has been confiscated by the Union Army anyway for his role in the war. While most of the town's Confederates were run out after the war, Mason said they didn't stay long, and most of them came back in the 1870s. And to give you an idea, my home county, the village that I was raised in, was named after the highest mountain in northeast Tennessee. So it is the most rugged county, and according to this article, there was only about 4% of the population was only slaves. Extremely small. And that would have been down probably at the county seat. You know, by and large, the Appalachians were too poor to own any slaves. And I just thought that would be interesting to tell you. Western North Carolina, for instance, just across the state line, there was a large Confederate training camp, where they would, Confederate boot camp, down in Morganton, North Carolina. Morganton is right at the foothills of where Appalachia truly begins. It is in the area where the Piedmont reaches Appalachia. It's in the foothills. And Camp Vance drew in a lot of Confederate fighters that were from the parts of northwestern North Carolina. Now, I talked a little bit about my father's side of the family. My mother's side of the family during this time, I believe, would have been in Ashe County, North Carolina. Ashe County is the northwesternmost county in North Carolina. It borders Johnson County, Tennessee, and the state of Virginia. I actually have a cousin that lives up in Ashe County that has a Telegram channel. I'll put a link to it in the box below. But me and him are related distantly, and I've also learned a lot of things from him pertaining to the War of Northern Aggression. Now, on my mother's side, I need to do more research, but I'm certain she had ancestors that fought perhaps for the Confederacy, being from western North Carolina. Although I cannot confirm this, I need to talk to my great aunt and do some research on my own to try to discover whether her family was perhaps pro-Union or pro-Confederacy. At this moment, I do not know. But I want to give you an idea quickly of just how contentious, just how violent. You know, a minute ago, I mentioned the Second Battle of Saltville. there were 2 battles. I find the guerrilla warfare between, say, the Confederate Home Guard, the Union Home Guard, and the citizens. A lot of atrocities were committed. A name, and this is a name that I might look into more deeply in the future, Champ Ferguson. Champ Ferguson was a very ruthless man out of eastern Kentucky. He was pro-Confederate, and one of his large job descriptions, probably the biggest part of his job during the Civil War, was to find deserters and to commit violence, you could say, against pro-Union, against citizens that had pro-Union sympathies. You could say that he was a Confederate terrorist of sorts. He ended up being hanged at the end of the war, but I believe it was after the first Battle of Saltville. Champ Ferguson and some of his men marched to Saltville, Virginia, and they led a massacre at the hospital there. He was an extremely ruthless man, killed dozens of men. That's a name I want to look further into in the future. You know, I have conflicted feelings myself about the Confederacy. But one of the things that I do admire about the Confederacy is some of this guerrilla activity. And even after the Civil War, the things that happened out west, Confederate outlaws, Quantrill's raiders, you know, I find this stuff extremely interesting. You know, this sort of rebel spirit, you could say. This disdain and contempt for authority and sometimes even morality. But to give you an idea of some of the atrocities, I've got a video here by a guy named Barry Van. He runs a YouTube channel called The Vantage Point. He makes a lot of very interesting videos on Appalachia. I believe he is an East Tennessean. I believe he knows of Barry McCain, who has written several books. Mr. McCain has written several interesting books about the Ulster Scots. This one is called Finding the McCains. This one is called The Loggin' Redshanks. But he's aware of Mr. McCain, and I hope Mr. Van doesn't mind me using an excerpt from one of his videos. I just want to give you an idea, a frame of reference about some of the atrocities that was committed here. So, here's Mr. Van.
One doesn't have to look to the Ozarks of Missouri and Arkansas during the Civil War to find cases of real-world atrocities. Southern Appalachia saw more than its share of civilian bloodshed during the national tragedy. As we'll see today on The Vantage Point, I'm going to share with you some seldom told cases of domestic terrorism and subsequent vendettas that scarred the mountainous region. One such case involved events connected to a pro-Union group of so-called bushwhackers led by Captains Gulman Bryson and later Enoch Voiles. I hope you'll join me. As I've mentioned in a number of videos, I was raised by my maternal grandparents. But I had a lot of interactions and support from my mom and dad as well as my father's parents. 3 of my grandparents were born and raised in the mountains and counties that border the Tennessee and North Carolina state lines. My dad's father was born a couple of counties over at the base of the Cumberland Plateau, but still in East Tennessee. All 4 of my grandparents were the youngest of each of their 10 or so siblings. That meant that their parents, my great-grandparents, were born before, during, and just after the Civil War. All of my grandparents, and parents too for that matter, were incredible storytellers. I can't count the number of times that I sat at their feet and listened to them describe real-world cases of moonshining, murders, farming, hunting, faith, and even extra-biblical supernaturalism. You might find it interesting that in our neck of the woods, the Civil War was colloquially remembered by the old-timers as the fighting between the Democrats and the Republicans. Despite living in secession states, my grandparents' grandfathers fought as Republicans or Unionists, although one started off as a lieutenant in the Confederate Army. I remember my grandmother Nanny telling me about a vendetta that was carried out against her great aunt and Uncle Payne. Her aunt and uncle assisted the local Union militia that was led by their in-law, Captain Goldman Bryson. They didn't have any money, so they gave Bryson's men food and shelter from time to time. Word of their assistance reached the ears of the Confederate Home Guard. In a manner similar to what happened to Josie Wales, Uncle Payne was plowing the fields while his wife was busy inside their tiny log home. With the windows open, she could hear the faint sounds of birds happily chirping and a light breeze rustling the spring leaves on nearby shade trees. Her contentment was broken by the fading yet jarring sounds of several horses galloping toward the field where Uncle Payne was working. She ran to the window and immediately saw that the riders were members of the Confederate Home Guard, and she knew that they weren't there to help with the fields. So she gathered herself together and ran out the back door. Near the edge of the woods was a fallen hollow tree. It had been blown over a week or so earlier during a thunderstorm. It was large enough for her to take refuge in it, which she did. Meanwhile, her husband was being led at gunpoint to a nearby tree where a couple of guardsmen tied his feet together. They threw the end of the rope over a limb and raised him off the ground feet first. Aunt Payne could hear her husband's screams as he disemboweled him alive. Meanwhile, other guardsmen were searching for her. Aunt Payne heard one of them say, "She might be hiding in that holler log over yonder." As fate would have it, the opening of the log through which she had passed was now covered by a spider web. So another guardsman blurted out, "She can't be in that log. There's a spider web over the hole."
So there you have it. That's just one example of numerous and many stories of violence and brutality being committed by both the Union and the Confederacy. So now, let's move on to the final part of the video. In this part, I'm going to discuss the various ethnic differences, the European ethnicities that settled this country, primarily the English, a bit about the Germans, the Ulster Scots, and the Anglos, the English. And also, we're going to discuss this sort of unique racial mythos, this Norman racial mythos that the Southern planters came up with, the planter class, that they were descended from compared to the Saxons, which were the Union. We're going to look at how these Southern intellectuals, using a variety of publications, one of the first and foremost being a paper called DeBow's Review, they promulgated this racial mythos back in the 1850s, and it was a bedrock for what you could say was Southern nationalism. And we're going to examine this, and then lastly I'm going to give you some of my thoughts about the future of the South and also the future of Appalachia and some of the problems that we both face. We'll sit out here and get a little evening sunlight. Josephus, what are you trying to prove? You know, I'm not a fan of studying things that don't have some sort of potential use or utility. Oh, there, Bobo. Not a fan of it. Time is precious, and mind power is precious. You see, right now I'm going to talk to you about this Southern race mythology. This is a book by Richie Devin Watson Jr. It is called Normans and Saxons, Southern Race Mythology and the Intellectual History of the American Civil War. It's a fascinating book. I learned about this book from my friend Ronan, who I've had on stream before. And I've enjoyed it greatly. It's a very dense book, lots of knowledge in here. The reason I'm studying this is because the Southerners, the planter class, had developed this extremely strong racial mythology regarding their ancestry. And this has utility to me because I would consider myself, like I said, a white separatist, but I'm also an Appalachian separatist as well. I want to see this region regain autonomy and resist influence from the outside. I want to see it solve its problems. Our greatest problem is drug abuse and poverty. It is extremely rampant here in Appalachia, as I've talked often about before. So this has utility to me. I want to see Appalachia become autonomous, to break away from this ruinous government that we currently labor under, this government that is killing us. I really have no love for America as a whole. I admire the cultural differences between the different regions, such as New England, the Midwest, Pacific Northwest, the South, Dixie, Appalachia, Ozarkia. I certainly admire the cultural differences in the regions. But I want to see us divorce ourselves from this bloated monstrosity whore of an empire that we live under today, because it's doing us no favors. I have no admiration for it in the least. But I'm going to read a few excerpts of this, and I've mentioned before, the Southerners, the planter class, developed this racial mythology where they were descended from the Normans. So let's get into it. Whenever there is a type of revolution that occurs, or any sort of separatist movement, there needs to be a sort of mythos. Alfred Rosenberg wrote about this in his Myth of the 20th Century. And the South, as I mentioned, the planter class, they developed this racial mythos. And I'm going to read a few excerpts from this book. There was a publication called DeBow's Review, and during the time of the 1840s, I'm not sure how long this publication actually ran, but it was a sort of Southern intellectual and cultural periodical that came out every so often. In the 1840s, the DeBow's Review spoke most highly of the Anglo-Saxon nature of Americans, and it boasted at how bright the future was in this country with our settlers moving further west and manifest destiny. However, due to the events in the 1850s, the tremors of the coming earthquake that was the Civil War, was it all started a lot with the abolitionists up north. The Southerners, these intellectuals, they characterized these Northerners, these Yankees, in their racial mythos. They claimed that they were of Saxon extraction. Now, that they were Puritans, they were descended from the Roundheads, while the Southerners, the planter class, was descended from the Normans, the Cavaliers, you could say. Now, they said that the Northerner and their attacks on Southern culture and their peculiar institution of slavery was fanatical, nonsensical, and that they were honestly dangerous. They portrayed the Northerners as barbarians, as the Northerners did to the Southerners. And it's really interesting. This book goes into tremendous depth. Sometime in the future, I may do a stream where I really tear it apart. But I'm just going to give you some of the generalizations here. let's see. In DeBow's review, and this is who promoted this Norman racial mythos the strongest in the South. Let's start here. We of the South have advanced rapidly on the intellectual, moral, and social development of our ancestors, perfecting the great work they began. The region's impressive cultural advances over a relatively brief period of time could hardly be surprising, given the noble qualities of the South's original Cavalier settlers. And this goes back, I believe, to the English Civil War, the class differences. It goes all the way back to 1,000 years ago, roughly, with the Norman invasion. Going back here, they were brave, honorable, social, loyal to their king and loyal to the church. Knowing that earth could not be made a paradise, they did not, therefore, seek to turn their fair footstool of God into a gloomy hell. Failings they had, but dishonor, sordid meanness, and mammon worship they knew not. And they served their king and their church with a loyal devotion that history had seldom paralleled. Their intellectual development was then not surpassed in Europe, and their moral culture was at least equal to that of their age. You know, here he's saying that the North could never hope to rival the South. They had inherited with interest all these characteristics of their Puritan ancestors, especially up in New England. And these unfortunate characteristics were misanthropy, hypocrisy, diseased philanthropy, envy, hatred, fanaticism, and all the worst passions of the human heart. These were the ruling characteristics of the English Puritans and therefore the Yankees. They hate us, is what this writer contended. They had hate and envy for Dixie. Skipping ahead here a little bit, by 1860, most Americans had come to look upon their society and culture as divided between a North and a South, a democratic commercial civilization, and an aristocratic agrarian one. Each section of the country, so it was believed, possessed its own ethic, its own historical traditions, governed by different values and animated by a different spirit. According to a theory then in vogue in the North had been settled by one party to the English civil party, the Roundheads, and the South by the other, the Royal Party or the Cavaliers. The Yankee was a direct descendant of the Puritan Roundhead and the Southern gentleman of the English Cavalier, and the difference between the two was at least partly a matter of blood. The terminology sometimes varied, but contemporaries generally settled upon such distinction as Saxon or Anglo-Saxon for the North and Norman for the South. Under the stimulus of this divided heritage, the North had developed a leveling, go-getting, utilitarian society, and the South had developed a society based on the values of the English country gentry. It was commonly felt, furthermore, that these two ways of life had been steadily diverging since colonial times. Now, I'm going to take a brief break here from the matter at hand, and I know some of you are probably going to want me to address the you-know-whos and their role in the Civil War. Now, honestly, I'm not going to say much about them. You know, I often have heard people say that the planter class was largely you-know-whoish in the South. While they did benefit from a sort of acceptance, you could say, in the planter class, that wasn't all. I believe I had read that they were roughly 150,000 Jews that were pro-Union up in the North, and there were only about 25 or 30,000 in the South. It's interesting because from what I've read, and I mean just looking at the history, there were prominent Jews within the Confederacy. All of you know, of course, about Judah P. Benjamin. I think he was the Secretary of War or State or something, but to sum it all up, of course, he was always in Jefferson Davis's ear, and when the war ended, before Reconstruction began, Benjamin conveniently sails back to England with a boat full of gold. and lives out his days with a cushy job as some sort of judge. So, there's several other names that I could name off. I'm not going to really dwell on that in this video because this is about us, Yes, I'm aware of who owned the slave ships and, all these things. But, some people will say, I've heard some people say the planter class was largely you-know-who-ish. I disagree with this. I mean, 25, 30,000 out of, I'm not sure how many citizens were in the South altogether. It's like what a controversial book that is in these circles that I've been reading recently, I'm finishing, is look at how the system is today. There's not enough members of the you-know-who-ish tribe for as large as our government is without a whole army and host of white traders. Anyways, going back to this, so yeah, I mean, they were on both sides, I mean, it's just what they do through history, And I honestly will say that I have a highly negative opinion on the planter class of the South. They were totally disconnected from reality. But let me get into that in a few. You see, you look at the history of the settlement of the South. Now, let me interject here. This Norman racial mythos was most prominent, and where its roots come from was the Tidewater areas of Virginia, on down into North Carolina, that little coastal strip, all the way down to South Carolina and Georgia. Now, is there any truth to this Anglo-Norman racial mythos? I do think that there is some truth to it. For one example, my wife, her ancestors, her family. My wife is from what we would consider the flatlands of North Carolina, Piedmont region, on over towards eastern North Carolina. Her mother and her father's surname, her mother's maiden name, are both prominent Anglo-Norman surnames. Her mother's mother, her maiden name, her grandmother, was a Norman surname. So I do think that perhaps there is some truth to this. That this is where some of these more aristocratic, affluent English settlers settled. But if you know anything about the history of the South, you'll understand that here in Appalachia, and I mean even myself, I know I'm jumping around a little bit, I keep remembering things, but even myself, I do have a Norman ancestor. Her name was Mary Ballou. Ballou is a Norman surname. Now this is generations upon generations ago. She is actually buried in Burke County, North Carolina, not far from Morganton. So I do think that there is some truth to this sort of Anglo-Norman racial mythology. But if you know anything about the settlement of Appalachia and in the interior of the South, states such as Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, on down into Texas, Oklahoma, Kentucky, these were mostly Ulster Scot descended settlers. Let me read here. There was a guy named David Hackett Fisher. He offered a richly detailed account of colonial immigration patterns in America between 1629 and 1775 that throws fascinating light on two discrete waves of settlement that carried to the southern colonies markedly different and sometimes oppositional sets of folkways. What he's talking about here is the Anglo-Norman versus the Ulster Scot. Let me see here. I'm sure that a lot of these this colony of Virginia, some of these Tidewater Anglo-Normans, these are people that had indentured servants. A lot of these indentured servants were probably the Ulster Scots. Of far greater numerical significance to the south was the fourth and final wave of British immigration to America from the north of Britain and Northern Ireland that flooded the colonies from 1718 until the eve of the Revolution in 1775 and settled initially in the Appalachian backcountry. This immigration consisted largely of farmers and farm laborers who owned no land of their own but worked as tenants and under-tenants. A large minority were semi-skilled craftsmen and petty traders. These immigrants, a people who became loosely known as Scots-Irish, or the Ulster Scot, vastly outnumbered the gentry-descended Englishmen who established the Cavalier Folkway in Tidewater, Virginia. The territory in which they eventually established themselves was also much larger than the relatively restricted dimensions of Cavalier settlement. Fisher observes that the Scots-Irish became the dominant culture across a swath of land that extended from southwestern Pennsylvania down through the highlands and foothills of the colonial South into the interior of the Old Southwest and eventually across to Mississippi into Arkansas, Missouri, and Texas. Scots-Irish immigrants thus dominated the lands that would comprise the major portion of the Southern Confederacy. Scots-Irish settlers carried with them and re-established in the South a folkway from the borderlands of northern Britain, strikingly different from the Cavalier culture of Tidewater, Virginia. It was a way of life characterized by a militant Christianity and by social egalitarianism, an unbending sense of personal pride and contempt for those very ordered hierarchies that had been sown in the soil of the coastal South by the Cavaliers from southern England. The settlers who came to dominate the interior South may have been poor in terms of possessions, but not in terms of their self-worth. As Fisher observes, their pride was a source of irritation to their English neighbors, who could not understand what they had to feel proud about. So how was it? How was it that the Ulster Scot, who became the spear tip and unfortunately the cannon fodder for the planter class's love of their peculiar institution of slavery, how was this? While their sorts of worldview, you could say, was oftentimes conflicted with one another, they clashed. They were diametrically opposed. Well, there was a writer named W.J. Cash. He wrote a book back in the 20th century called The Mind of the South. And in it, he answers that Cash understood that the essential Southerner, the man at the center, was not the Virginia aristocrat, but the backcountry pioneer farmer from whom the vast majority of present-day Southerners could trace their ancestry. This simple rustic figure, he wrote, was the true center from which the Old South proceeded, the frame about which the conditions of the plantation threw up the whole structure of the Southern mind. As Cash's phrasing suggests, Dixie's dominant population of pioneer farmers, rather than rejecting the hierarchic folkways of the Tidewater South, the Cavalier, had allowed their yeoman ethos to be subsumed into the Cavalier ethos, achieving a strange, even grotesque, imaginative synthesis. In the romantic simplicity of their thought processes, Cash observed, Dixie's Scots-Irish yeoman seemed to have believed for conscious purposes that in acquiring land and Negroes they did somehow automatically become aristocrats. So this is really fascinating stuff, in my opinion. And you know, this Norman mythos didn't seem to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the native Europeans who were living in the South were poor white farmers. You know, in just mainstream education and history today, it seems that we have, everyone thinks that, oh, the South was so wealthy and everyone was a plantation owner and everyone had dozens of slaves. You know, this is absolute nonsense. And this sort of racial mythos had a blind spot. It didn't acknowledge the Ulster Scot, the poor yeomanry. Of course, there were different classes. You had the planter class on top, which owned dozens, maybe even hundreds of slaves, large plantations, made a ton of money, you could say. And then you had your middle class farmers, who may have possessed a few slaves. And then at the bottom, you had the poor white farmer. The planter class, they viewed themselves as noble, aristocratic, and that they ruled their slaves with firmness and fairness, while looking at the poor whites who absolutely detested, they despised their peculiar institution of slavery. Because, I mean, think about it. They're taking work from these poor white farmers, and they've got it given to their slaves. A lot of times I do think that perhaps the slaves were better off than these poor whites. And I think we all could agree here that the peculiar institution, as it's referred to, is an unmitigated disaster. I see it as that completely. You look at it from the black point of view, of course. They were torn away from their continent and their heritage and thrust into the New World. And we still see the fruits of that to this very day. And we also deal with the problem as well. And in the future, like I said, I'm going to go more in depth to this because there's so much information. I mean, you could get I could make numerous videos about the different aspects of this. But what do I think about the future of the South and of Appalachia? Well, I consider Dixie and Appalachia. We do have commonalities. We do have our similarities. We are both, of course, Native European. Some characterize the South as largely Celtic due to the Ulster Scot influence, but there's also the Saxon, the Anglo, even the Norman. And what I see currently, here in the South, in Dixie I should say, there is some interesting observations I've made over the years. The only place that I've ever lived, other than a couple of parts of East Tennessee, the northeast corner and now the southeast corner, I lived in Louisiana for a period of time, outside of New Orleans, on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. And I traveled extensively across the South during this time. My least favorite southern state, I have to say, is Georgia. I can't help it, and I don't mean to offend any Georgians here. It's not my wish to do so. Maybe it's where I work predominantly in the state of Georgia. I work predominantly down in Floyd County, Georgia. It's hotter than hell, which it's not much different than here. You know, it's only about an hour and a half away. They grow a lot of cotton in Floyd County, out on the back roads. Floyd County is where I would consider it, perhaps the foothills of Appalachia. They grow a ton of cotton down there. And I'm not the only one who has made this observation before. I've talked to several other people. Georgia is going to miscegenate itself out of existence. I work predominantly out in the country there. And I see so many mulattoes. I mean, I've harped on this before. And I see it from people, and I've gotten to know quite a few people down there. I see it from boomer conservative grandparents who have their Trump signs still up in their yards. They'll have a kinky-headed couple of mulatto grandchildren, So it seems that miscegenation is much more rampant in North Georgia. than it is compared to states like in Alabama and Mississippi. Even though Mississippi, I believe, has the largest black population in the United States, it seems that there is a bit of segregation still, you could say. Now, of course, miscegenation knows no boundaries. It's not just... I don't mean to, just dunk on Georgia here. I mean, it's a problem all across the South, all across the country. But you don't see it quite as much, anywhere near as much in Alabama and Mississippi. And I've traveled extensively through all three of these states in my life. And Georgia, you better do something. I mean, it's, I don't understand it. I mean, and this is in like rural North Georgia, okay? This isn't down in Atlanta. I mean, it's everywhere. Why is this? Georgia is practically turning blue before our very eyes. You could say election fraud, this and that. Yes, that's probably true, but it seems like Georgia as a whole seems to fall more for this progressive bullshit that's, shoved down our throats regularly. I don't know. I hate to say it, it seems like the South is going to end up like Brazil. I mean, look at the proximity to Mexico, Central America. I don't understand. I don't know what's going to be done. I do find this alarming, to tell you the truth. And I'm not saying these things to, be, I'm just black-pilled or I'm buying into, you-know-whoish propaganda. Shut the fuck up. I know what I fucking see. Alright? And I'm not exaggerating it. I don't know. Southerners are going to have to do something, you're being invaded. We're all being invaded, of course, the last decade or so, 2 decades, you see these, especially the Biden administration, busing these migrants all into far-flung areas, all the way up into Maine, up in New England. It's a bleak future. Here in Appalachia, we have our own problems. Our biggest problem is drug abuse and nihilism. And we have to do something about this. We have to solve these problems, or we are going to end up in the same situation. You see what happens for the South, I blame their love of college football. I swear, I could see some of these boomer conservative grandparents being like, oh, I just love my mulatto grandson. He's going to be the next star running back for the Georgia Bulldogs. It's just, okay, man, your grandkids don't look nothing like you. And some of these grandkids live with their grandparents, Is it just that their mothers are on drugs or, just so sorry that they don't have anything? I feel sympathy for them in a way, I see this so often. And here in Appalachia, what happens is you'll have these drug dealers. My friend Patrick has talked about this numerous times. And I have seen this as well in southern Appalachia. What happens, especially up in central Appalachia, West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and also in southern Appalachia to a degree, you'll have these black drug dealers that'll come in from places like maybe Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, or here in southern Appalachia, they come up from, say, Charlotte, North Carolina, maybe Atlanta. And what happens is they will get these white girls in these rural communities, these white girls that are kind of on the fringes of society, you could say. May have had a rough upbringing, maybe their parents were worthless, just drug addicts themselves. And what happens is these black drug dealers will sometimes push the dope in. They'll move into these areas. And, they just use these white girls as a place to crash, knock them up, and a place to distribute their drugs. I have seen this. Patrick has seen it often. So we do have a lot of problems if we want to preserve our racial integrity in both Dixie and Appalachia. Going back to the planter class, I have grown to view the planter class by and large with contempt. I don't like them. Their peculiar institution, their love of it, is what has put our current situation. This is what has led to our current situation, to this very day. You know, back then, I don't think they could have fathomed what all has happened culturally and societally. You know, this sort of miscegenation that is so rampant. I don't think they could fathom, you know. And I mean, it's kind of hard to see what's going on 150 years into the future. But I view them with a lot of contempt. They took advantage of the poor white farmers in the South. And it was just a tragedy all around. You know, I was listening to an interview by Jan Lamprecht and Tom Metzger. I think this was probably sometime in the 2010s. And Metzger was railing against the peculiar institution in this particular interview. And he had done, I would love to be able to find this research. He had done some research of his own into the history of the South. And if the South would have refused having slaves, if they would have just stuck to the model of employing, say, the poor white farmers, using them as labor, paying them a living wage, a decent wage, if they would have just stuck to even small farming, the South's GDP, annual GDP, leading up to the Civil War, the institution of slavery only added about 20% to their GDP. I wish I had more details to give you here. I only heard about this in the interview. And I do believe that it's true. You know, I do believe that. Because the white man is industrious, and he finds a way to get things done. Instead of having to rely on slaves, we didn't need them. We never needed them. So I don't have a very high opinion in the least regarding the planter class. I do admire the Southern fighting spirit. And even to this day, whenever I see white people out, maybe they got a Confederate flag on their truck, maybe they got a shirt, like a Dixie Outfitters shirt, I admire that. They should have pride in their heritage. But I have an awful taste in my mouth when I talk about the planter class. I despise them and what they did. And we're still dealing with that shit to this very day. Is there anything else? This video has taken me a couple of months, it seems, to make. And I hope that it has helped clarify some things. I find this period of history to be extremely interesting because it echoes all the way up until today and will continue to echo into the future. I thought this was a fascinating book. Here in the future, I will probably draw more material from this book. And I think it's fascinating, you know, looking into the future. I find this Norman racial mythos, even though I don't give a damn about the planter class, I do find this fascinating, that they made their own racial mythos. I want to do something like that for the heritage Appalachian, perhaps centered around the Ulster Scot, the German, and the Anglos that settled here. Because you need something like that. It is a sort of foundation, a sort of bedrock for doing great things, for building a structure that will protect us and see us through this turbulent future. I just wanted to say that thank y'all for watching, and that this book here and the things that I've read, it seems to confirm that perhaps these old world blood feuds between Normans, between Saxons, between the Celts, these old world blood feuds led to unbridled New World violence. Thank y'all for watching. Bye-bye.